Today, we are going to map out the architecture of a psychological dynamic that can turn the feeling of being deeply understood into a cage. We're talking about predictive modeling and what happens when the person who seems to get you better than anyone is actually just using that knowledge to, well, make your free will obsolete.
You know, we generally assume that when a partner can anticipate our moves, it's the ultimate sign of a deep, incredible bond. But in these really high-pressure dynamics, your own biological drive for consistency, for being reliable, gets weaponized. All your best virtues, your kindness, your guilt, your desire for harmony, they get turned into a map that allows a controller to pre-solve your resistance before you even feel it coming on.
So does this sound familiar? That feeling when you try to stand up for yourself, but it feels like you're just reading lines from a script they already wrote for you? That's the core paradox we're talking about today. That moment your psychological consistency becomes the very mechanism of your containment. And let me be clear, this feeling is not an accident. It's the result of a very specific, carefully structured environment. So to really get this, we first have to look at the environment itself. We're moving away from a world of authentic, spontaneous interaction and into something that feels much more like a simulation, an environment that's been primed to produce very specific outcomes.
The central idea here is something called predictive modeling. Now, in behavioral science, this is rooted in a cognitive shift we call pattern recognition. But in this context, it's so much more than just noticing patterns. It's about actively using them to forecast and, well, manage someone else's reactions. It literally turns your personality, your very essence, into a map that someone else can read and navigate, sometimes even better than you can in the moment.
And look, this dynamic isn't just limited to one type of relationship. We see it everywhere. It plays out in high-stakes corporate negotiations, where tiny little tensions are analyzed to find someone's breaking point. It absolutely shows up in enmeshed family systems, where a scapegoat is managed by constantly preempting anything they might say. And of course, it's incredibly common in romantic partnerships, where one person might keep this kind of mental digital ledger of their partner's emotional triggers, all to control their interactions.
So this is the really crucial point, this cognitive shift. On one side, you have authentic spontaneity. That's when you trust your gut, you follow your impulses, and you act freely. But on the other side, you have environmental priming. And here, your actions aren't free anymore. They're just reactions, based on these calibrated, predictable patterns that someone else has set up. You're not really acting. You're just reacting along a path they've laid out for you.
So how does this trap even work? Well, the first mechanism is something called the inevitability hook. This is when the target, the person being predicted, starts to believe that the controller's uncanny ability to forecast their reactions is proof of some deep connection or some kind of superior insight. You find yourself thinking, wow, they just get me. But what feels like being in sync is actually just strategic forecasting.
And that hook leads directly into a state of what we can call fated exhaustion. It's this profound sense of physical and emotional paralysis. You start to feel like your reactions are so cliché, so predictable, that there's just no point in trying to change them. Every single time you react as expected, it just reinforces this deep sense of helplessness, and you stop trying.
And this quote just nails the power shift. When one person occupies the space of the forecaster, they effectively turn the other person into the algorithm. It's a dehumanizing process, really. One person is the strategist, the thinker, the predictor, while the other becomes a set of predictable inputs and outputs. A problem to be managed, not a person to connect with.
The end result of this whole process is strategic helplessness. Over time, the target's brain is literally conditioned to accept the dynamic as permanent. They stop noticing red flags, they stop questioning the situation, because they've been convinced that this is just how it's always going to be. Their own personality becomes the leash, and they completely lose the habit of even imagining a different way of interacting.
So how is this environment actually built? I promise you, it's not magic, and it's definitely not random. There is a systematic, three-step playbook that turns a person's free will into a predictable algorithm. So let's break it down. This playbook has three very distinct phases. First, you have the data mining phase. Second, you have the preemptive strike. And finally, number 3 is identity rigidity. Just understanding these steps can turn a confusing, emotionally draining experience into an observable, understandable strategy. All right, let's dive into step 1, the data mining phase. This is the intelligence gathering stage. The controller carefully observes and maps your reactions, often to these tiny, seemingly insignificant stressors. What they're doing is testing your reaction threshold. How much does it take to get a response? And here's the insidious part.
During this phase, it often feels wonderful. You feel deeply understood, you feel seen, you feel listened to. You're sharing your vulnerabilities, not realizing they're being cataloged for later use.
Next up is step 2, the preemptive strike. This is where the controller shifts from just passively observing to actively framing you. They use what's called a linguistic frame. It's a carefully chosen phrase that's designed to trigger your stress response before you even have a chance to react authentically. The conversation is basically over before it even begins because you've already been put in a box.
Here is a classic textbook example. I already know you're going to get mad, but think about what that phrase does. It instantly puts you on the defensive. The focus is no longer on whatever the actual issue is. Instead, you're now completely preoccupied with managing their prediction. You're trying to prove you're not going to get mad, which completely derails your authentic emotional response and just hands control of the entire interaction right over to them.
And all of this leads to the final and maybe the most crucial step, identity rigidity. See, your brain is biologically hardwired to seek social consistency. We want to be seen as stable and reliable people. So when someone repeatedly assigns a role to you, like the angry one or the sensitive one, your brain, in an effort to maintain that consistency, will actually start to unconsciously perform that role. You lock yourself into the predicted behavior just to avoid the discomfort of being called unpredictable or unstable.
And what you get is this self-reinforcing cycle of containment. It's a loop. First, the controller makes a forecast. This triggers a feeling of shame or exposure in you. So, to resolve that discomfort, you lock in to that predicted role. And then, and this is the kicker, the controller points to that very reaction as proof of their initial forecast, validating their insight and just tightening the loop. It's a perfect, inescapable trap.
Okay, so we've seen the how, but what about the why? Why does one person do this, and why is another person vulnerable to it? This next part explores the core psychological motivations at play. It's really a battle between the need for sovereignty and the need for consistency.
The controller's motivation can often be boiled down to a drive for what's called total interaction sovereignty. This isn't about connection, it's about control. The goal is to own your future reactions, to eliminate all surprises. If they can predict and manage your every move, they gain absolute leverage and are never ever caught off guard. For them, it creates this feeling of ultimate safety and power.
And this right here really illustrates this central conflict. The controller's main tool is something called anticipatory regulation. This is just a biological reality. It is incredibly difficult for our brains to just ignore a forecast about our own behavior, especially when it comes from someone we depend on. And on the other side, the target's vulnerability is often this deep-seated need for consistency. That's social conditioning that teaches us to value being seen as a stable, predictable person more than we value being a free, spontaneous one.
Okay, so we've analyzed the problem, the environment, the motivations. Now let's make that crucial turn from analysis to action. This isn't about confrontation, it's about awareness. This is your playbook for reclaiming your own psychological sovereignty.
The very first tool is the script audit. This is a really simple but powerful act of self-analysis. The goal is just to pause and ask yourself, in this interaction right now, am I genuinely being myself, or am I just acting out a part in a pre-written script? Am I choosing my responses, or am I just hitting my marks? And the core question of your script audit is this: is this person's so-called insight into me a gift that's fostering our connection, or is it forecasting that's being used as a cage to limit my options? Just reframing their understanding of you in this way is the first step toward finally seeing the bars of the cage.
From that audit, two clear action steps emerge. First, you have to learn to recognize the inevitability hook as it's happening. Feel that sense of, oh, here we go again, and just label it in your mind. Second, and this is the key, you begin to practice strategic randomness. This is all about consciously choosing to break the pattern.
So what is strategic randomness? It's the simple act of intentionally choosing a response that is not the predicted one. If the script calls for you to get mad, get curious instead. Just ask a question. If the script calls for a long, drawn-out defense, just calmly say, okay, and nothing else. The purpose here isn't to win the argument. The purpose is internal. It's to interrupt that neurochemical cycle of fated exhaustion and helplessness in your own brain, and to remind yourself that you always have a choice.
Ultimately, this whole thing comes down to a powerful internal permission slip. Reclaiming sovereignty means accepting that I am allowed to surprise myself. You are not a fixed algorithm. You are allowed to grow, to change, and to react in new ways, even if it makes someone else uncomfortable because they can't predict you anymore.
And this brings us to what might be the biggest lesson here. We so often mistake predictability for intimacy. But real, healthy intimacy thrives on spontaneity and surprise. It allows room for both people to be unpredictable, to grow, and to change. It doesn't require you to finish their sentences or to perform some consistent role just for their comfort.
So, the crucial point to take away from all of this is right here. Someone who uses your patterns to trap you is not your soulmate, they are your strategist. And recognizing the difference between a partner and a strategist is the very beginning of reclaiming your own freedom.